She was 17 years old, and she had nowhere left to sleep. That is not a figure of speech, and it is not the beginning of an exaggeration. It is simply the condition of Nora Calloway on the morning of October the 4th, 1893, when the man who had promised her father on his deathbed to keep her safe instead put her trunk on the porch of his house in Harlan Flats, Kansas, and locked the door behind him. Her uncle, Gerald Calloway, had used her inheritance, every cent her father had ever saved, to cover gambling debts she had not known existed, and when the money was gone, so was his interest in her. She had $11.30 in the pocket of her coat. She had her mother's quilt folded under one arm, and she had nowhere to go. What she found at the far edge of the Harlan Flats rail yard was an old Union Pacific passenger car, detached from any engine, sitting in the weeds on a spur of rusted track that went nowhere. The station master, a tired man named Pruitt, told her the car had not moved in 4 years and that she could have it for $9 if she wanted to be rid of his paperwork. Every sensible person she had ever known would have told her that buying an abandoned train car with most of her remaining money was the act of a girl who had lost her mind along with everything else. But inside that car, beneath the third bench from the rear, wrapped in oilskin cloth and bound with cord that had once been red, there was a ledger, and what was written in that ledger would not only save Nora Calloway, it would save an entire town that did not yet know it needed saving. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Calloway. If you are watching from a place that feels forgotten, a town, a season, a chapter of life that the rest of the world seems to have moved past, tell us about it in the comments. You are not as alone as you think. Her father, James Calloway, had been a schoolteacher and a carpenter, and he had the particular quality of a man who understood that those two things are not so different from each other. You begin with the raw material. He used to say, wood or a young mind. It does not matter which. And you study what it wants to become, and then you help it get there without breaking it. He had come to Kansas from Ohio in 1874, following the railroads and the promises they carried west. And he had settled in Harlan Flats because the land was flat and the sky was enormous, and he had decided that enormous skies were good for children who needed room to think large thoughts. Nora's mother, Clara, had died of fever when Nora was 4 years old, and so her earliest real memories were not of her mother, but of her father's hands, wide, careful, stained always with walnut oil or chalk dust, moving over the surfaces of things, feeling for what needed fixing, what needed coaxing, what simply needed to be left alone. He taught her arithmetic on the same chalkboard where he taught his students, and he taught her to read from the same primer, and he saw no reason why the daughter of a schoolteacher should be kept at home while other children went to learn. She sat in the back of the classroom from the time she was 5, and she listened to everything, and what she did not understand she wrote down in a notebook she kept in her apron pocket, and she asked about it at supper. He also taught her carpentry, not because he believed she would become a carpenter, though as it happened she had a finer eye for joinery than most grown men he knew, but because he believed that a person who could not fix a broken thing was a person who would spend her life at the mercy of people who could. He started her on small projects, a birdhouse, a step stool, a repair of the porch railing that had split during the ice storms of the previous winter. By the time she was 12, she had rebuilt an entire section of the schoolhouse floor, planing the boards flat and fitting them tight enough that the draft that had bothered the children's feet for years simply ceased. The men who came to inspect the work pulled at the boards and found nothing to pull at. They were impressed in the way that men of that era were often impressed by competence in a young woman. Quietly, and without quite saying so, her father also kept meticulous records. This was a thing she noticed without understanding its importance until much later. The way he wrote everything down, income and expenditure, notes from town council meetings, a running account of repairs made to school property and their costs, who had donated what and when and under what terms. He kept these records in a series of small notebooks, green-covered, stacked in a wooden box beside his desk. He called it his memory box. He told Nora once that a person's memory is the most important thing they carry, and that paper is simply a way of giving your memory a body so it can outlive you. She had laughed at the time, because she was 15 and her father was in good health, and the idea of him needing anything to outlive him felt distant and abstract, the kind of thought that belonged to old people, not to a man who still climbed ladders without hesitation and read by lamplight until midnight. He died 18 months later of a heart that had been weakening for years without announcing itself. He was 51 years old. Nora was 16, and she did not know what she was about to lose beyond her father, because she did not yet know that her uncle Gerald, her father's younger brother, who had been in Harlan Flats less than a year, who had arrived with smooth talk and an easy smile and an unexplained urgency that she had taken for enthusiasm, had already begun helping himself to the small savings her father had been keeping at the Harlan Flats Bank. She had trusted him because her father had trusted him, and because grief in those first months had taken up so much of the space inside her that there was little room for suspicion. She had understood, by the spring of her 17th year, that something was wrong, not in a sudden way. The understanding came the way a bruise comes, slowly darkening from an injury you almost did not feel at the time. Gerald paid the household bills irregularly and then not at all. He sold the horse. He spent evenings at the back room of the Harlan Flats Mercantile, which everyone in town knew was where Hitch Drummond ran card games for men who could not afford to play them. He told Nora the money was being managed, that her father had left things complicated, that she should not worry about things she did not understand. She understood more than he knew. She had her father's habit of paying attention and her father's habit of writing things down, and she had been making quiet notes since January of that year, tracking what Gerald brought in and what he spent and what matched and what did not. By April, she knew the account her father had left was nearly empty. By June, she was fairly certain it was gone entirely. She went to the bank in July. The clerk, a young man named Adler who had been in school with her and who had the decency to look ashamed, confirmed that the account had been closed in March by one Gerald Calloway, acting under a power of attorney that Nora had never been shown and whose authenticity she had no way to quickly challenge. When she went home and asked Gerald directly, he did not deny it. He told her that debts were debts, that her father had always been sentimental about money, to the point of impracticality, and that the world did not run on sentiment. She asked him what she was supposed to do. He told her she was nearly an old enough girl to find a husband, and that in the meantime she was welcome to stay and help with the cooking. She did not find a husband. She did not stay and help with the cooking. She spent the summer doing piecework, mending, laundry, small carpentry repairs for neighbors who were willing to pay a girl in coin rather than in kind, and she saved everything she could, and she tried to determine what legal remedies existed for a minor whose guardian had stolen from her, and she found that the remedies were few and slow and required more money than she had to retain an attorney. She might have endured it longer if Gerald had not, in late September, brought a woman from Dodge City to stay in the house, a woman who looked at Nora with the frank, measuring expression of a person reassessing the arrangements, and told Nora the following week that the house had become crowded and that her room was needed. He put her trunk on the porch on a Tuesday morning. He did not look at her when he did it. The door clicked shut with the particular finality of a man who had decided that a locked door absolved him of everything that had happened behind it. She stood on the street with her trunk and her mother's quilt and $11.30, and she was 17 years old. And the autumn sky above Harlan Flats was a particular shade of pale blue that means winter is not far behind it. She did not weep. She thought about her father's hands, how they felt for what needed fixing, and she thought about what needed fixing now. And she started walking toward the rail yard. The rail yard at the edge of Harlan Flats was not a grand place. It was a flat expanse of cinders and gravel, crossed by 3 sets of tracks, flanked by a water tower and a low freight shed and a station master's office that smelled of tobacco and old paper. The station master, Elias Pruitt, was a man of 50-some years with a patient, slightly defeated air of a man who had been passed over for promotion enough times that he had made his peace with it. He sat behind a scratch counter and watched Nora approach with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to assume anything about the people who came through rail yards. She told him she needed a place to stay and had $9 to spend, possibly 10 if he had something worth 10, and she asked what he had. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat, told her to follow him, and led her out the back door of the office across the gravel to the far spur, where the old passenger car sat in the weeds. It had been a fine car once. That was apparent even now, in its state of long neglect. The exterior wood paneling was warped and grayed, but the bones of it were solid, and someone had built it well, with the kind of attention proportion that outlasts paint. It was perhaps 50 feet long, with windows on both sides, most of them still intact, the glass haze with years of dust. Inside, The benches ran in rows, upholstered in cracked green leather that had dried and split in the Kansas heat and cold. The floor was gritty with old cinders. A small iron stove stood at one end, its flue pipe still connecting, if rustily, to the ceiling vent. The whole of it smelled of dust and iron, and the particular aged sweetness of wood that has been out of the weather long enough to forget what rain smells like. Nora walked the length of it twice without speaking. She pressed on the walls. She looked at the roof joints. She got down on her knees and looked at the undercarriage through the gaps in the floor, which were few. She opened the stove's door and peered up the flue. She knocked on the side paneling in several places and listened. Pruitt watched all of this from the doorway. She told him she would give him $9 for it. He asked if she wanted a receipt. She said she wanted a receipt and a bill of sale. He said he would have to look up the paperwork. She said she would wait. It took him an hour to find the relevant documents, and at the end of the hour, she had a receipt in her name and a bill of sale that legally transferred to one Nora Calloway possession of Union Pacific passenger car number 7 of the Harlan Flats Spur, formerly used in service on the Emporia line, retired from service in the year 1889. She had $2.30 left in her pocket. She had a home. She spent what remained of that first afternoon moving her trunk inside and sweeping the floor clean with a branch from one of the cottonwood trees that had grown up around the spur. She used her quilt to cover the bench at the far rear of the car, which became her bed. She found that the stove drew well once she cleared the accumulated debris from the flue pipe, and that as she fed the dead cottonwood branches, the car warmed tolerably within a quarter hour. She was making a second pass with her improvised broom when the branch snagged on something beneath the third bench from the rear, the one just forward of where she'd laid her quilt. She got down on her knees with the lamp she had found in the freight shed and had begged a wick and oil from Pruitt, and she looked beneath the bench. The plank that formed the base of the bench seat extended nearly to the floor and was joined at both ends of the frame. At first she thought she had only caught the branch on the frame joint, but then she saw that the base plank was not flush with the frame the way it should have been. It sat perhaps a quarter-inch proud on one side, as though something had been wedged beneath it, or as though it had been installed deliberately to conceal a space below. She set down the lamp and used the flat of her pocket knife to work at the plank's edge. It came up more easily than it should have, which told her it had been lifted before. Beneath it, in the shallow space between the plank and the car's floor, wrapped in a piece of oilskin cloth and bound with a length of cord that had once been red and had faded to the color of old brick, was a book. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment before she touched it. The oilskin had kept it nearly dry. When she unwound the cord and folded back the cloth, she found a ledger, a proper accounting ledger, the kind used by banks and merchants. It's covered dark green with a band of red at the spine, its pages yellowed but intact. On the inside front cover, in a careful, controlled hand, someone had written a name and a date. Meridian Land and Damp Settlement Trust, accounts April 1887 to March 1889. C.B. Whitmore, trustee. She did not understand immediately what she was holding. This is important to say, because the temptation in stories like this one is to make the protagonist wise from the beginning, to have her see at a glance what took her days to unravel. Nora Calloway was not omniscient. She was smart, and she was patient, and she was thorough, and those qualities serve her better than omniscience would have. She began reading the ledger that first night by lamplight, her quilt around her shoulders, the stove burning low, the Kansas wind making the car creak and settle on its old wheels. The handwriting was consistent and neat, the hand of someone trained in clerical work, accustomed to columns and precision. The entries ran in the standard accounting format: date, transaction, debit, credit, balance. But the entries themselves were not standard at all. The Meridian Land and Settlement Trust, she came to understand over the following 2 evenings of careful reading, had been established in 1887 under the laws of the state of Kansas for the purpose of holding and managing lands granted to homesteading families in the Harlan Flats region. The federal government had, in the early 1880s, granted tracts of land to a group of settlers under the Homestead Act, and this trust had been organized to hold the deed records, collect the payments that the settlers made against their land contracts, and ensure that the land passed fully and cleanly into the settlers' ownership once their terms were met. It was, on its face, an instrument of community welfare, a way of keeping the paperwork orderly and the settlers protected. What the ledger revealed across 67 pages of entries, was that the trust had not operated on its face. C.B. Whitmore. She found a reference that told her this was Cornelius Beaumont Whitmore, who had served as both the trust officer and as the agent for the Harlan Flats land office during the period in question, had been collecting payments from settlers and recording only a portion of them. The rest, represented in a column he had labeled simply with a cipher that took her 3 days to decode, had been diverted. Where they went, the ledger did not say in so many words. But the cipher, when she worked it out, corresponded to entries in a second section at the back of the ledger, where partial names and dates suggested payments made to individuals, not settlers, but officials, bureaucrats, a county recorder, a territorial land inspector. He had been paying people to look away. And the consequence of those diverted payments was written plainly in another column, which tracked the settlers' balances and their payment status. Families who had paid faithfully for years, whose real balances showed them nearly clear debt, appeared in a parallel column, the official column, as delinquent, behind on payments, in danger of losing their land. She thought her father's voice. Paper is simply a way of giving your memory a body so it can outlive you. She thought of how many families in Harlan Flats had come to own their land in the end, and how many had not. She thought of the Breckenridge family, whose farm north of town she had walked past 100 times, abandoned now, the house gone gray and the fence fallen. She thought of the Olscott family, who had left in 1890, and whose departure everyone in town had attributed to hard luck and bad harvests. She thought of old Werner Haas, who still farmed a small place east of the rail yard, but who had spoken at church once, when she was small, about how he had nearly lost everything to a land dispute he never fully explained, and how he had only kept his land because, and here he had stopped himself and changed the subject. She began on the 4th day to make a list of names from the ledger and to compare them against what she knew of Harlan Flats families, past and present. She had her father's notebooks. They were in her trunk, all of them, the green-covered record books from his memory box, because when Gerald had put her on the porch, he had not thought to go through her belongings, and her father had kept his notebooks in her room in the last year of his life, when he had been unable to climb the stairs to his study. She had not known, until now, why she had felt so strongly that she must keep them. Her father had attended town council meetings from 1876 until his death. He had written down names, dates, transactions, disputes, resolutions. He had noted when families left town, and when they cited land troubles as a reason. He had noted, in his careful way, the names of the families who had come to him distressed about payments they said they had made and could not account for, and whom he had helped write letters of inquiry that, she saw it now, had never received satisfactory answers. Between her father's notebooks and the ledger, she began to build a picture of what Cornelius Beaumont Whitmore had done, and to whom, and for how long. And she began to understand that what she held in her hands was not simply a record of old crimes. It was a document that could be the basis of remedy. She sat very still in the lamplight one night and thought about what she was going to do. She was 17 years old. She had $2.30. She owned a railroad car. She had been defrauded of her own inheritance by her own kin, and she now possessed evidence of systematic fraud against an entire community of settlers, documented in the hand of the man who had committed it, preserved by what she could only describe as an accident of hiding and forgetting and the extraordinary chance that someone had bought this car instead of burning it for scrap. She thought about what her father would have said. She thought about the raw material and what it wants to become and how you help it get there without breaking it. She put the ledger back in its oilskin cloth, tied the cord carefully, and placed it inside her trunk, beneath the quilt her mother had made. Then she went to sleep, and she let herself dream about what she would do next. She went first to Werner Haas. She went to him because he was 71 years old and had been in Harlan Flats longer than almost anyone, and because he had been one of the names in the ledger. She had found his entries, found the diverted column, found the discrepancy between what he had paid and what had been officially recorded, and because she remembered him stopping himself at the church. She thought that if anyone would believe her without requiring her to explain herself for an hour, it was a man who had already half known. She walked his farm on a Thursday morning, carrying the ledger under her arm in its oilskin wrapping. His wife, a small woman named Greta, opened the door, and Nora asked if she might speak with Werner about a matter of some importance. Greta looked at her for a moment, this girl in a worn coat, holding a package of oilskin, and then said yes and brought her inside the kitchen where Werner Haas sat at the table with his coffee, an old man with hands like the roots of cottonwood. She opened the ledger on the table and showed him his name and his entries. She explained the cipher and what it meant. She showed him the parallel column, where his real payments were recorded against the official record of deficiency. She watched his face as he understood it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that had roughened with years and weather, that he had known something was wrong, and that he had not known how to prove it, and that the men he had gone had turned him back every time, and that eventually he had simply kept his head down and paid more than he should have until they left him alone, and that 3 of his neighbors had not been able to do the same. He asked her where she had found it. She told him. He looked at the oilskin and the worn cord, and he shook his head slowly, in the way that old men sometimes do when the world shows them something they were not prepared for. Then he looked at her and asked what she needed. She told him she needed someone who had standing in this community, who would go with her to the county seat and to the land office and, if necessary, to a lawyer, and that she believed the ledger gave them grounds to petition for a review of the land records for every family Whitmore had defrauded, and that she thought several of those families might still have grounds to recover their land or be compensated for its loss. Werner Haas put his coffee cup down and stood up from the table and went to the hook on the wall and took his coat. He told Greta they would be back in 2 days. Greta, who had heard every word, packed him a meal for the road without being asked. She had not anticipated resistance in the direction it came, and this is another thing worth saying plainly. Nora's story would not be honest if we made every obstacle obvious. The resistance came from a man named Sutton Price, who was a current holder of the Harlan Flats land office, not Whitmore, who had died in 1891, but a man who had inherited not only Whitmore's office, but, as it turned out, a portion of the arrangement Whitmore had put in place. The Land Records Office, Price had long believed, was a quiet place, and quiet places, in his experience, were best kept quiet. When Nora and Werner arrived at the county recorder's office in Parsons with a ledger and asked to file a formal petition for records review, the clerk at the counter looked at them with the expression of a man receiving information he did not want and told them to wait. They waited for 2 hours. Then Sutton Price himself appeared, a heavy man in his 40s with a wide face and small eyes that moved quickly for a man who otherwise moved slowly, and told them that the records they were referring to had been audited in 1890 and found to be in order, and that a ledger produced by an anonymous party from unknown circumstances had no legal standing, and that if they persisted in this matter they might find themselves in difficulty for presenting fraudulent documents. Werner Haas, who had 71 years of patience banked up against exactly this kind of moment, looked at Sutton Price for a long while before he spoke. Then he said quietly that Nora Calloway was the daughter of James Calloway, who had been the schoolteacher in Harlan Flats for 17 years, and whose personal notebooks documented the testimony of no fewer than 9 families who had reported payment discrepancies to him between 1882 and 1887, all of which names appeared in the ledger, and that those notebooks were currently in the possession of a lawyer in Parsons who had agreed to take the case on contingency, which was true because Werner had sent a letter 3 days earlier from the general store in Harlan Flats without telling Nora, who he had thought might lose her nerve if she knew how serious he was taking it. Sutton Price's small eyes moved between them. Werner added that the lawyer's name was Albert Fenwick, and that Fenwick had been trying to embarrass the land office in Parsons for 6 years over an unrelated matter and would be grateful for the opportunity. Price told them to wait again. This time they waited for an hour. When he returned, his face had rearranged itself into a careful neutrality that was different from the bluster he had walked in wearing, and he told them that the matter would be reviewed. It was not a triumph. It was the beginning of a process that would take the better part of 2 years and would require Nora to attend hearings, produce testimony, and sit in rooms where men who did not expect her persist consistently underestimated how long she would persist. But the ledger held. The cipher held. Once a clerk with no investment in the outcome decoded it independently and arrived at the same answer she had. Her father's notebooks held. And Werner Haas, who had stood still in the same county his whole life and outlasted everyone who had tried to move him, held. Cornelius Beaumont Whitmore was dead, which meant that the justice available was not the kind that could be served to a living man. This is perhaps the most honest thing that could be said about the resolution that followed. It was not dramatic. There was no courtroom moment of revelation, no confrontation, no single day when everything reversed. What there was instead was a methodical recalculation of records, family by family, entry by entry, running through the corrected ledger with the kind of patience that the original fraud had been designed to outlast. The Olscott family, who had gone to Oklahoma, received a letter in the spring of 1895 informing them that a portion of their original homestead claim had been restored and that a settlement had been reached on their behalf. They came back. Not all of them. The children had scattered, but the parents came back, and they stood in the door of their old house, and they were very quiet for a long time. 3 other families received compensation. 2 pieces of land that had been resold following the false delinquency findings were returned through a legal process that Albert Fenwick took some satisfaction in describing in detail to anyone who would listen. Werner Haas received a formal acknowledgement that his land payments had been misapplied and a restitution of the excess he had paid over the years to keep his farm. He used it to repair his barn. He told Nora it was the soundest barn repair that had ever been funded by a railroad car. As for Sutton Price, he did not go to prison because the evidence of his involvement was indirect and he was a man who had taken pains to keep it that way. But he did resign from the land office in the fall of 1894, citing health reasons, and he left Parsons and was not heard from again in that county. This is the quietest kind of justice, the kind that does not announce itself, and it is the kind that suited Nora's understanding of how the world actually worked. Gerald Calloway, who had no connection to the railroad car matter, found himself in a peculiar position in Harlan Flats during these 2 years. He had been comfortable so long as Nora was simply a girl with a grievance and no resources. But Nora was no longer that. She was a young woman who had surfaced a fraud affecting a dozen families, who sat alongside Werner Haas in county offices, and was received with the kind of attention people give to someone who has demonstrated that she knows what she is doing. The lawyer Fenwick, who had a comprehensive interest in the proceedings, quietly reviewed the question of the power of attorney Gerald had used to empty James Calloway's account, and found that it had been prepared by a notary who had since been disbarred. The matter was added to filing. Gerald, who had been watching proceedings with increasing unease, moved to Wichita in the summer of 1894. The woman from Dodge City did not go with him. Nora did not recover the money her father had saved. This, too, is the honest version of the story. The money was spent, and the legal mechanism for recovering it was slow and expensive and produced, in the end, a judgment that Gerald could not satisfy and did not attempt to satisfy. She let it go, not because she did not deserve it, but because she understood, in the way her father had understood things, that the cost of carrying a certain kind of anger is paid by the person carrying it. What she received instead was her father's house. It had been Gerald's under the arrangement that had pushed her out, but when Gerald left and the woman left and the house sat empty, Fenwick found provision in the original title that Gerald's power of attorney had not actually covered, and Nora, as James Calloway's sole heir, took possession. She was 19 years old. She had a house and a railroad car that she converted, over the preceding 2 years, into a workroom. The benches removed, a workbench installed, her father's tools arranged on hooks along the wall, the stove burning steady through the winters. She did fine carpentry for the town and for the farms beyond it. She kept her father's notebooks in a wooden box beside her workbench, and she kept the ledger in a second box beside them, because she believed they belonged together. 2 kinds of memory, 2 bodies of record, preserved through separate accidents of care, reunited in the end in a place where they could do no more harm and no more good, but simply rest, accounted for. We told you, at the start of this story, that Nora Calloway had nowhere left to sleep on the morning of October 4th, 1893. We told you about the trunk on the porch and the locked door and the sky the color. That means winter is coming. We told you about $11.30 and a railroad car in the weeds and a station master with too much paperwork and not enough imagination to see what an old passenger car might be worth to the right person. We want to circle back to that morning now. Not because we need to revise it. Every word was true, but because mornings like that one have a way of looking different once you know what came after them. Here is what else was true of that morning. The ledger was already there. It had been there for 4 years, under that bench, in that oilskin cloth, tied with cord on the color of old brick, waiting in the only way that inanimate things can wait, patiently, without urgency, without knowing what it was waiting for. It had survived the Kansas winters and the Kansas summers and the mice and the rust and the indifference of everyone who had passed through that rail yard without thinking the old car worth a second look. It had survived because someone had hidden it carefully, and then whatever accident of death or departure had kept that someone from retrieving it had, paradoxically, become the thing that preserved it. Nora Calloway was not a girl of exceptional luck. She was a girl of exceptional attention. She had been taught to look closely at things, to press on walls and listen to the sound, to feel for what was loose and what was sound and what was being concealed. Those were her father's lessons, delivered in a workshop that smelled of walnut oil, and they had given her the capacity, on the floor of a cold and abandoned railroad car with a lamp and a pocket knife, to notice what others had not. She bought the car for $9 because she had $9 and nowhere to sleep. What she got, in addition to a roof and a stove, was a piece of someone else's unfinished business, and a particular combination of tools. A carpenter's eye, a schoolteacher's daughter's records, an old man's patience, and a lawyer's hunger for a righteous fight needed to finish it. The town that did not know it needed saving was saved, quietly, without fanfare, over 2 careful years. The families whose stories the ledger carried were, as much as they could be, made whole. The ones who could come back came back. The ones who could not at least knew the record had been corrected, that the paper which had called them delinquent and dishonest had been revised, that their own memory had been given a body that would outlive the men who had tried to erase it. And Nora Calloway, who had been put out of house with $11.30, built a life from that number that her father would have recognized as a life he tried to give her, useful, honest, grounded in the conviction that the right tools in the right hands can fix almost anything, and that the most important thing you can preserve is an accurate account of what happened. Thank you for spending this time with us today. If this story reached something in you, if it reminded you that value has a way of surviving in the places people overlook, that a careful eye can find what negligence conceals, that a record kept honestly is never entirely lost, we hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. We have one question for you, and we would love your honest answer in the comments. What is a time in your life when you found real worth in something that everyone else had written off? A place, a person, an old object, or even a version of yourself? The comments on this channel are one of our favorite places in the world, and your stories matter here. If you haven't already, please subscribe and ring the bell so we can keep bringing you stories like this one, slow, true feeling, and worth your full attention. Until next time, stay close.